Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for joining. Today is Friday, October 15th, the 8th, no, the 9th of Cheshvan, right? The 9th of Cheshvan, Mar Cheshvan. And we're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Masechet Shabat, we're in the final page of chapter 8, Hamot Tziyayim, and we are still discussing the dimensions of the items that can and cannot be carried on Shabbos. We're on a 3-day detour or mini unit that's discussing the handling of hygienic stones used for hygienic purposes, how it's used, when it's muksa, when it's not, which substances and alternatives are prohibited, and which alternatives are permissible. Today will be the 3rd day on that topic. Before we start, I do have to say that I did a little digging, and I think I was remiss in not acknowledging the question of tearing toilet paper on Shabbos. I'm not here to give you a psak halacha. I'm not here to tell you what you should do. What is certain is that one ought to prepare in advance toilet paper, or to have this appropriate hygienic cleansing material in your restroom for Shabbos. That is certain. However, there are halachis, and in the halachic responsa, those who ask the question based on our Gemara, which is what should one do if they find themselves in an unanticipated restroom. You were walking and your neighbor asked you to come over to discuss, maybe you're a doctor or a dentist or an accountant, I don't know, but obviously a permissible Shabbos discussion. And they ask you to come over and you come by for l'chaim and you go to the restroom and you find that there is not paper. So there are poskim that ask, what should a person do under such circumstances? And there are poskim who advise, as someone referenced more than once, that based on the premise, based on the principle of our Gemara about Kavod Habriot, there would be additional wiggle room to possibly tear toilet paper. This posek that I saw, and now I'm forgetting the name, advises, and again, this was brought up by someone in the class, to tear it in a shinoi, in an atypical manner, not in the conventional manner, and as well to not tear on the lines. By not tearing on the lines, you're not doing precision cutting, which is another of the malachis. And by doing it kilachar yad, you're downgrading. And again, we'll see some of this in Rashi in a moment. You're downgrading the potential malacha from being a biblical to a rabbinic prohibition. And as we've discussed, it is possible, according to some of the opinions, and we'll see perhaps soon, that there are some varying opinions that doing this tearing, although rabbinically prohibited, the Chachamim might give a waiver in the situation of Kavod Habrios. So I was remiss in not bringing that up yesterday. And so whoever brought it up, I'm not telling you if you should or shouldn't do that, but that is certainly a proposed solution based on and born out of our Gemara. What I still need to get back to you is how that might relate to more complicated issues, such as an automatic flush. I am certain that poskim discuss it. I just didn't come across it yet. And so bli neder, if and when I come across it, I will certainly want to share that with you as well. And I have a feeling there are some varying opinions and possible incorporation of these principles there as well. But I certainly only want to share with you something that I've seen from an authoritative source. And so that was yesterday's Gemara. Today, we're going to continue a little bit on the subject of the right materials, but we'll allow ourselves some detour and some additional discussions, which I think you'll find very interesting. At least I did. So thank you for being on board on this Erev Shabbos. Let's get the Gemara and we will get started. We should say thank you to Safaria for providing this wonderful resource that allows us to study remotely with all of the necessary texts and translations, and certainly a wonderful resource. And they've contributed vastly to our Torah study, as well as I'm sure many others. 82b. If you recall, we spoke about as well toothpicks being muksa and not, and why that might be different than a restroom. And we said that a mealtime is predictable. Come in. Come in. No worries. I'm in the middle of a class, but you're coming for a second. Come on in. Excuse me, folks. Shalom Aleichem. Are you visiting in town? You're new in town? First of all, Baruchim Abayim. Gentlemen, give me 1 second.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
No, I'm staying at the Tides for like a month.
Okay, very nice. So this is the shul.
Yeah.
Come tonight 6:30. Tomorrow, 8 or 10, we'll have 2 minyan. Yes.
Okay, great.
If-
Is there a weekday minyan?
Sunday 8, and the rest we'll play by ear.
Okay, all right, thanks.
What's your name?
Aviel Rab.
Avi Rab. So you're here for a month. So where's the next stop?
Well, I live in Hollywood.
Okay.
And my place isn't ready.
Okay.
I'm in between places.
All right. Shalom Aleichem. Thanks for stopping by. Rabbi Kudan. Welcome. Sorry, folks. All right. So again, we concluded yesterday a discussion about about the difference between a kavod habrius related matter where you should have anticipated and should have prepared versus where you had no choice to prepare. And that was yesterday's Gemara. All right, let's continue a new discussion. Amar Avuna taught asur lifna lifanes b'steinir b'Shabbos. It is prohibited to defecate in a plowed field on Shabbos. Rashi, b'steinir. What is a steinir? By the way, bookmark this word. We'll see it some more in the coming tractates. Charisha rishoina v'oimed l'zriya. It's a field that has had its plowing, it's been prepped, and it's waiting for the seeds to be deposited and then recovered. And one cannot use that field as a restroom. Why? So the Gemara asked them, my timer. If the issue is that you're messing up your friend's greatly the hard work that went into preparing the field, and so now you're messing up his work. Davsha, are you treading on the furrows and destroying it? Rashi mishum davsha. If the problem is it's your friend's field and you're messing up his hard work, well, afilu b'chol nami. That's not a nice thing to do and should be prohibited always. You never want to mess up your friend's work. The Ella, rather. So what might be the issue? Mishum asavin, a concern of grass being uprooted. How will grass be uprooted? Rashi, shemachmas lachluchis hanir, because you've recently plowed the earth, and so you've turned up moist earth from a lower level. Asavim oilam alat surar, it is a prime place for small grasses to sprout on the stone that you might be using to cleanse yourself, providing a bonus fertilizer to your friend's field. And by using the stone, you will inadvertently uproot the grass on the stone, and that might be a problem. So again, why can't you use a plowed field? Answer one, for trotting, well, that would always be a problem, so that can't be the issue here. If it's because you're uprooting grasses, Reish Lakish taught, we already have a teaching that Reish Lakish permits using a stone even if it has grasses on it. Why? Rashi, it is not your intention to uproot those grasses, and it is indeed permissible, says Rashi, the halacha of Rabbi Shimon, because we're going to follow the halacha of the perspective of Reish Lakish. Hello? Oh, that says it's permissible. And so therefore that can't be the problem. That can't be the problem for using the field on Shabbos. Now, Reish Lakish does also say that toilesh mimena b'Shabbos, if you actually uproot the grass, I'm sorry, chayiv chatas, you'd be chayiv chatas. So you certainly cannot intentionally uproot the grass that's on this rock, but if you use it just in lieu of toilet paper, well then that's acceptable. Rashi mishum asavim. No, if you don't have kavanah in this circumstance, Reish Lakish says it's permissible. If you do so with intention, then chayiv, because the uprooting of this grass is being uprooted from its place of growth. Now, here's the thing. Rashi points out. Usually, we imagine a plant planted on earth, in the ground, and so if you uproot it from the ground, that's obviously uprooting. But here you have a stone with a little bit of earth and something's growing on it, so you might not imagine that the uprooting of that grass should be considered uprooting. So Reish Lakish says it is considered uprooting, and if you do it with intention, you're chayiv. But if you do it without intention, under our circumstance here, for the need of restroom hygiene, it would be permissible, says Reish Lakish. Now, here's the question. Here it is a psik resha, right? Here it certainly is just about 100% certain that you're going to be uprooting the grass. So we'll see the Gemara a little further, but I imagine this is part of our waiver for Kavod Habriyos. So being that you're allowed to use a rock from a field, even if there's grass on it, so that can't be the reason not to use your friends or not to use a freshly planted yard as your bathroom. So what really is the problem with defecating in a plowed field? Our concern is that you might take a stone or rock or earth that's on the top and fill up a hole, right? You know, when a plow goes through a field, you have a furrow, and then you have on this two sides, it's elevated. And so we're afraid that you might take earth that's on the higher point and bring it to the lower point. And what's the problem there? And you'll be culpable, you'll be guilty of doing an act that Rabbah taught us. And by the way, we saw this Gemara previously, and that will be the problem. What is the problem? The Amar Rabbah, Rabbah taught. What happens if you have a hole and you smooth it out, you flatten it out with other earth? If you do it in your house, remember this? Then it's as if you've constructed. What have you constructed? You've improved and built upon and created a floor for your home. Now you might recall we had a whole discussion about the material that floors were once made of. Is it earth or was it stone? Is there a difference between the ground floor and the second floor? But anyways, for the purposes of our Gemara, Rabbah does not allow you to smooth out a hole in the ground. And if it happens in a home, it's considered boina. You're improving and constructing a home. And if you do it in a field, chayiv mishum chayresh, you have in a sense committed a part of the act of plowing. Let's see, Rashi. Well, how are you plowing? Because you're essentially moving around the earth, and that is not permissible on Shabbos. So just to recap. Rav Huna taught you can't use a field, and the Gemara has to go through a whole thought process to identify what would be uniquely problematic with using a plowed field on Shabbos. Some of the potential issues are items that you need to always be mindful of. Other issues are not issues at all, but ultimately we can settle on the problem that Rabbah taught, which is if you're going to take a stone, use it, and then place it down, you may come to find yourself smoothing out a hole. Let's read Rashi. Shakel miloi mimakim gavshushis. You might take from where the earth is solid. V'shadi l'satoi, and you'll throw it into l'makim guma, into the hole. Umashve hacharisha, and you're helping smooth out the area of the plowing. V'heve tolda dechayrish, and this is a byproduct. This is an offshoot of plowing, and that is not permissible on Shabbos. Now the Gemara quotes the teaching of Rabbah and says, in a house you cannot smooth the earth. Rashi, shayich binyan, it's considered building. V'zeh shemash v'gumais binyan haritzbahu, and when you do it in a structure, in a home, you're smoothing out the floor. Ubasadeh, and if you do it in a field, misakin hacharisha, you're essentially perfecting, fixing, and improving upon whatever imperfections may have occurred as a result of the plowing. Now, give me just 1 second. I'm sorry. Shalom Bear. Sorry about that. Let us take a fast glance. Just to show you the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam, Kolamash v'gumot, if you smooth out holes, harei zechai mishum chayresh, this is considered like plowing. L'fichach, therefore the Rambam paskins, osko li'fonais b'sdei hanira, b'Shabbos, you're not allowed to use a plowed field as a restroom, gzeira shema yashva gumais, lest you end up smoothing out those holes. So this is ultimately the reason that's given in the Rambam in his halachic work to yet prohibit such such an act. To use the restroom, to use the field as a restroom. Just want to remind everyone, because it's a little quiet, I did hit mute all at a certain point. Please unmute for any questions and comments. And so yeah, that is that. Farshim. All right, Gemara continues. Gufa, let's assess the teaching of Reish Lakish that we referenced in passing. What was the teaching of Reish Lakish? Reish Lakish said, if a rock that you're going to be using for hygienic post-restroom purposes, even if it has asavim, grasses on it, it may yet be used for this hygienic purpose. However, if you intentionally uproot those grasses, chayev chatos, you are chayev chatos. Amar Rav Papa taught, Shmamina mid Reish Lakish, we can infer from the teaching of Reish Lakish a different halacha. Hai par pisa, a flower pot. Shari lital tule, one is permitted to carry, to move this flower pot. Give me a moment and we'll see how he infers this, and then we'll challenge this assertion. But let's take this step by step. So again, Reish Lakish says you can't pluck off a grass, but you can pick up a rock, although the grass is being elevated, right? Think of it, a piece of grass growing on a rock, it's close to the earth. When you pick it up, it goes flying. It's no longer on the ground, but it's still attached to the original rock. And Reish Lakish says that's not a problem. Let's read Rashi. Mid Reish Lakish. The Omar Mutalekaneach, he says you're allowed to use a rock that has grass on it. V'loy amrinon tzorarzeh ha'asavim she'alu milachluches hakarka hein yotzim. We don't say, you know how a piece of grass grows on a rock? The rock doesn't have nutrients. The grass somehow gets from the broader environment its nutrients. Again, although the Gemara or the Rashi, maybe they didn't have the exact scientific understanding of how stuff grew back then, but they have this understanding that, of course, anything that's going to grow is going to be extracting nutrients and whatever else allows it to live from the ground. And by lifting up the rock, one might think that they're detaching the grass from its ultimate growing environment. Although the grass itself, this piece of grass, is on top of a rock, but we imagine and we understand that its environment of growth is entire area. And the fact that we allow you yet to pick up the rock is an indication that it's not considered uprooting the grass that grows on it. We don't consider that by lifting it, you're taking it off of its growing environment. Now,
grass doesn't really grow.
So that's what I was going to say. I honestly, maybe I should have learned this Gemara again. Or now that I've learned this Gemara, when we go on a hike, we'll have to look around. But I don't know if you frequently see grass growing on a rock as much as maybe moss.
Yeah.
Moss. But is moss a plant?
I don't know. It might be like one of the, because it doesn't really, it's not getting nutrients from the soil where it's getting it probably from the air. Yeah, good old Google.
Well, Google says that moss is a plant. Mosses are small, non-vascular, flowerless plants in a taxonomic division, and it may refer to the parent group, which okay. So Mark, I think we can establish that although moss is not exactly grass as we understand it, it would it would qualify yet halachic. Well, I don't know about halachically. Google considers moss like a plant, and so we can imagine that whatever the halacha is about grass would be applied as well to, or potentially applied as well.
Mushrooms a plant. Then.
No, mushrooms we said is an entirely different story, right? But notwithstanding mushrooms, hold on, there's someone in the waiting room. Okay, he's trying. And so therefore it's plausible, it's possible that this teaching is talking about something akin to moss. So we should do one more Google.
Rabbi,
Yes,
for them, in the context of what they're looking at, it's irrelevant. There's green stuff growing. For them, it was grass or moss. They couldn't distinguish. It didn't matter. It's a question of the green stuff on the rock.
I'm not going to say that they could not distinguish, but I'm comfortable saying they may have chosen not to distinguish.
Yeah,
And so however we choose to look at it, there are plants that grow on rocks, and we're not concerned about uprooting those plants. That's what Reish Lakish taught. By extension, the Gemara wants to say, Rav Papi wants to say that a flower plant as well that is perforated, right? That's important, and we'll see soon, can be picked up. What is the analogy? What is the commonality between a flower pot, a pot with a hole in it, and the rock? Well, I think we might say it's quite obvious. A plant is growing on the rock. You pick up the rock, the plant is still attached to the immediate thing that it's growing upon, but it is being removed from its broader environment. The same thing, if you have a flower pot with a hole on the ground. So the flower pot, if you give it enough time, the roots will come through the hole. It's essentially part of the environment, the broader environment where it's growing. And yet, if you lift it up, the plant remains in its immediate space and it's not considered being uprooted. But now we have an important investigation we need to do, and I know it's going to capture your attention. It captured mine. So please join me now for an interesting journey through Rashi. Hi par pisa. What is a par pisa? So now you're wondering, what in heaven's name could ever be so interesting about a flower pot? If a flower pot is generally not a very dramatic event. So let me show you. Atzitz naku. We're talking about a perforated, a flower plot with a hole. Shezaroi boy, that you grow in it. Not very remarkable. However, Chuvas Hagoinim, in the responsa that is dated back to the Gaonic period. The Gaonim were the sages who led the Jewish people and were in charge of Jewish scholarship and halacha after the close of the Talmuds until the onset of the period that we refer to as the Rishon. So who would be like first generation or close to the first generation of Rishonim? Maybe Rashi, Rambam, around the middle of 1000, 1100, let's say. Well, the Rambam was a little after 1100, Rashi was in the 1100s. Prior to that, you have the Gaonic period. These were great Torah scholars and authorities, primarily based out of Iraq, ancient Iraq, Baghdad, or Bavel, as we call it. And the leader of the community was called a Gaon, and the general scholarship and Torah scholars of that period are scholars from the Gaonic period. And so we have Teshuvot from that era, over 1,000 years ago, quite possibly close to 1600 years ago, who taught as follows. Matzasi sha'osim chotalot, we would make these kind of pots, mikapot marim, from palm branches. Umimalin otam afar v'zevel, and they were full with earth and fertilizer. Behema, talking about animal provided fertilizer. The Chavbeis, Oitesvav Yom Lifnei Rosh Hashanah, 15 days. I'm sorry, I read this terribly. Okay, I'm inclined to say this is Chavbeis. Okay, sometime prior to Rosh Hashanah, Oisim Kol Echad VeEchad L'Shem Kol Katan Uktana Shabbat. Approximately 2-3 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, they would take for each youth, each child in their home, and they'd plant some beans or kidneys. And they would call this handmade planter with beans and earth, and they would grow. They call it parpisa. The planted seeds would sprout. Are you ready for this? Prior to Rosh Hashanah, Shaloi. Every person, every child, every household member would take their planter. Umachziroi. Are you ready for this? It would be waved over their head 7 times. Ve'oimer. Hold on. Ve'oimer. Ze tachas ze. Or ze tachas ze. This is instead of me, v'zeh chalifasi, v'zeh timurasi. This will be my exchange. This will be my, give me a good word, timurasi. This will be in my stead.
Substitute.
My substitute. Umashlichoi linahar, and it would be cast into the river.
Nicer than swinging a chicken.
So I would say mind blown. This seems to be an origin or an earlier form of practice very much similar to our kaparis. Granted, our kaparis is done prior to Yom Kippur. It's generally done with with an animal or with money. It's done only 3 times. It's not cast into the river. But here we have an early version of what we know as kaparis, and it was called a parpisa. And Rashi chooses to sneak this gem, this nugget, into Gemara Shabbos. And if you look in not all scholarship, but if you look in scholarship that attempts to trace the source and the history of kaparis, if you're dealing with a real scholar, inevitably or invariably, you'll find them referencing this Rashi here that tells us of this early proto-kaparis practice.
In general, the Rabbanim were really against using chickens, but
So I would be careful to say in general, but I will say there were a number of Rishonim. I think the Rashba famously, and others who were opposed to the practice of kaparis. There were, however, others that were not opposed to the practice of kaparis. And in more recent times, following the Arizal, and so for the last several hundred years, it has become quite prevalent in many communities. There were, however, always individuals that resisted kaparis, and it's possible, although I'm not certain, that the Gaon of Vilna may have been opposed to kaparis and others, but today it's achieved a great degree of prevalence in the Jewish community. Of course, there are those that use chickens. There are those that use fish. There are those that use money, and but anyways, if you thought we were just learning about a little bit of agriculture and uprooting on Shabbos, I bet you might have not been expecting to be afforded this gem, this nugget of Jewish tradition here, a potential origin or an original version of kaparis. Now, I heard, interestingly, we say when we do kaparis, ze chalifasi, ze timurasi, ze kaparasi. So we say khalifa, timura, and kapara. So the first letter of each of those words, taf, timura, khalifa, chas, and kapara, spell the word chatach, which might be the reference, the name for the angel who allocates parnasa. And so it's possible that in origin, this was a parnasa-oriented ritual. Of course, ultimately, the reason why we do kaparis today is more symbolic of if we were destined to not deserve to live out the year, so it should be in our stead. It's meant to inculcate sensitivity and value to life, right, to the appreciation of life. And so we're supposed to look at the chicken and appreciate that this could have been happening to us. But anyways, this is a fascinating Rashi, and it's quoted a good bit in the discussion of kaparis, and so I wanted to take a little bit of time and share it with you today.
It's very interesting because there's a big movement every year that it's a pity on the chickens and much discussion. And nowhere did I see anybody say, hey, Rashi has a solution for us.
I do want to add, however, that I think I'm not going to tell a person that they should eat meat. But if a person is going to choose to eat meat, it behooves them to understand where that meat comes from. And it behooves them to expose themselves to this process, because hopefully they'll have a greater degree of sensitivity, appreciation, and value of meat. So, and if you choose not to eat, that's your business. But I think if anything, kaparis, if you're uncomfortable about kaparis because it forces us to face the truth of how we get our meat, that's not a good excuse. A person that's vegetarian and they don't do it because they don't want to take the life of an animal, then I respect their choice not to do kaparis. But if you eat chicken and you're just uncomfortable or squeamish, I think it's an act of sensitivity and respect to face up to how we got that chicken. And what I'm saying may be controversial, but that's how I see it. At the very least, we should know what the animal has to give up for us to have a Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever else it is.
Let me ask you then, is there a preference? Is there a hierarchy as far as, to me, it doesn't make any difference which one I use. However, it is easier for me to use, and I've always used it, except when I was a child, when my mother used to bring the chickens home. But otherwise, growing up, when I was on my own, I always used money. It's just, first of all, chickens weren't available. Today they're available. They make a big thing of it. They take the kids to show the kids. It becomes a spectacle.
Right.
Is the hierarchy as far as what's preferable?
There are varying opinions in that regards. Those that come from a more mystically inclined or Kabbalah inspired way of life would have a preference to doing kaparis. As a matter of fact, one of the Hebrew words for a rooster is a gever, right? We say that the morning, the crowing of a rooster, we sometimes refer to it as the, doctor, help me out. But basically, gever could be a reference to animals. And so there is an idea that we take a gever to remind ourselves that it's instead of this gever. So if in heaven they said that this gever is going to have trouble, we take another gever to replace it. However, there are those.
So what happens to the woman? You use it for the woman too.
Correct. Well, gever means a person. I mean, maybe in this context, it means more of a man, but the same thing would apply to women. So I'm not telling you what you should do. There are, if different rabbis will probably give you different opinions. And I would say people should try, if they have a family minhag, to stick to the family minhag. However, I think it behooves us to make sure that those chickens are treated humanely and also are actually going to be consumed. Because to take the life of a chicken, for it not to be fed to anyone, I think would be a horrific.
They feed the students.
It goes to the poor people or sometimes organizations. What happens, I think, in large cities is a lot of times educational institutions sponsor it. They sell the chickens and take the money, and it supports needy scholarship funds, let's say, in an ideal circumstance. And then the chicken itself might be served in the yeshiva. I know some yeshivas that serve kaparas chicken. There are other communities that give the chicken literally to needy families, and so there are varying options. But if you're going to do kaparas, we should make sure that they're
I'll tell you, growing up in Tel Aviv, my mother would go to the market, buy the chicken. After we did kaparas, take it to the shochet. It would shecht it. We'd give it to someone to pluck the feathers off, bring it home, and then we used it.
Okay, that's cool. That's and it must have been an important educational moment, for better or for worse, for the kids.
It was not considered an educational. It was by default. But it was just the way it was done. It wasn't just my mother. It was, most people did it that way.
Interesting.
And before Yom Tov, you always had a few carps swimming around in the bathtub, alive. And then my mother would take a stick and hit him over the head, and we learned the fish anatomy.
And this was gefilte fish, or just a nice
no, that was a regular carp.
No, I'm saying carp. What happened? What happened?
Gefilte fish happened. They turned into gefilte fish, or not. It depends.
Dr. Stamler, if I had the ability, I would clip this little part of you sharing what you're sharing, and share it with some youngsters who would do well to understand how what it was like, how Tishrei in Israel looked not so long ago. So thank you for sharing.
Going back to the story the professor told about the picking up dung in the streets, the Bedouins, even today, collect the camel dung and use it for fire. And it was all part of it.
And then they charge American tourists a lot of money to sleep with a fire made of that dung.
Look, I grew up without any, and this is Tel Aviv, mind you. This is not the periphery. I grew up without a telephone. I was 19 before we got a telephone at the house. No television. There was no gas. There were no washing machine, no dishwashers. My mother would wash once a week the clothing in a big metal round tub, and use she would cook it, and it was called a primus. It was a big kerosene lamp, and we cooked on kerosene lamps.
The professor is shaking his head. It seems like there's a similar experience.
It's a Russian word. Kerosene primus is a little miniature stove with kerosene container, and you pump this container so that the pressure would allow the fuel to go up and there was little burner. Actually, it's a small power one, a small power burner for cooking. It was very often used in Russia, but of course the gas replaced it eventually.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Rabbi,
Rabbi, okay.
you
We have
didn't
two.
have.
We have two. We have two
It was
barrels in the
very
queue.
stable. It was very easy to knock it off and have all the fire hazards related to split kerosene.
Wow. All right. I'm gonna let the two barrels decide who goes first.
The doctor first.
Okay.
He's a Levi.
He's a Levi. Levi's first, right? Isn't that what they say?
Rabbi,
Doctor? Your connection's a little iffy, I think. Or is it my connection? I don't know.
that went on many interesting descriptions, and
Yeah, doctor, we're struggling with your connection out here. Try again.
yeah, I'm struggling with my connection. I just wanted to make a comment that all of these very interesting stories, quote, which we just experienced, is a whole field which today is called, experiential education, and which we realize is often more informal, is more important than, or without official instruction, but just by experiencing things. So whether it's how to wash clothing or kaparas or all of these things, just interesting.
So you're saying, although Dr. Stamler's mother may have not intended it for it to be an educational moment, but ultimately that's understood to be the greatest form of education.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Shkoyach. And Rebero?
Yeah, I just wanted to say you didn't have to be in Tel Aviv. My grandmother went to the market, bought a chicken, took it to the shoichet. We had fish in the bathtubs. You didn't have to be in Tel Aviv. We did have a phone, but it was a party line.
Shkoyach. So I'm gonna make this sheer mandatory listening for folks that are complaining about having to schlep to the kosher store, and they're not sure if they should get the chicken that's the cutlets that are double fin or single fin, and they don't know if it should be so I'm gonna tell them they got to listen to this shir before they continue kvetching about that. Shkoyach everyone for sharing. All right, let's do a little more Gemara. So we took a detour to talk about kaparis, which is of course the reference in this Rashi. Back to our Gemara. We're talking about uprooting a flower pot and uprooting the rock. And Rav Papi says that we can infer from the teaching of Reish Lakish that one can lift up a flower pot. Shari litaltoli. You're allowed to lift it up. Rashi, v'loy amrin and toilashu, and we will not call this uprooting. However, this opinion is not going to stand. Maskiv Rav Kana challenges this assertion. Im amru litzoyrech yomru shalai litzoyrech. You think we're just going to allow you to dabble in almost uprooting a plant on Shabbos? No. There's a very narrow and specific circumstance where the Chachamim are more lenient, and that is kavod habriot, the need for human beings to do their business and to emerge hygienic, clean, and able to re-emerge in society. You think we're just going to allow you to dance around with a flower pot because you want to rearrange your front porch or your front lawn? Of course not. Rashi. L'tzoyrech kinuach, wiping is kavod habrios. But we're not going to give such a license under any or all other circumstances. So we have Rav Papi who wants to make this connection. We have Rav Kana who challenges it. And Rav Kana is not just challenging this specific assertion, but it sounds like we're having a discussion about how far the permissibility of moving this rock is. Is it a heter? Is it a leniency under important and pressing circumstances? Or is it totally not an issue? Amar Abaya taught halachically on this matter. Parpisa. Hayil, the asal yadan, being that we've come to talk about this subject, Lema Milsa, allow me to say something. Haya munach al gabe karka. Here is a halacha. Milsa means a statement, but it's a halachic statement. Haya munach al gabe karka. If the flower pot was on the ground, v'hinicha al gabe yeseidos, and he lifted it up and placed it on a board, it's elevated and no longer immediately touching the earth. Chayev mishum toilesh. This means that he has uprooted a plant. Haya munach al gabe yeseidos, and if it was on top of beams, it was not on the ground. V'hinicha al gabe karka, and then he placed it on the ground. Chayev mishum noitea. This is considered planting. Now, just to remind you, we're talking about a perforated flower pot. So a flower pot that has holes. And Abaya says, we got to clarify the situation. Attaching it, putting the flower pot with its hole with earth to the ground is like planting. Picking it up is like uprooting. Rashi. Chayev mishum talish. The plant can no longer extract nutrients from the earth if the flower pot is removed from the earth. The high chayev lav dafka. Oh, Rashi now is going to say something very powerful. My opinion, we use the word chayev here, which makes it sound like you've done a biblical act. Rashi says, I don't think halachically you've actually committed a biblical uprooting. Rather, it's prohibited. The Chachamim disallow it. Mishum the dami l'toilish, because it is very similar to toilish. So Abaye is using extreme wording, but Rashi says you have to understand he's not really intending to say it's you would have done a biblical prohibition. The chayiv mamish kamar, because if you would literally be biblically in trouble, do you think that the Chachamim would allow you, even under extreme circumstance, to break a biblical prohibition? No. The Chachamim give a license only in the arena, only in the kind of matters that are being determined by the Chachamim. When the Chachamim make an additional safeguard or they make an additional stringency, of course, they can provide a waiver for certain circumstances. But the Chachamim are never going to allow one to do a biblical prohibition. Again, the Ichayev Mamish Kamar, if it's literally a biblical problem, so basically, Rashi is making an important point. You think the Chachamim are going to allow you to do a biblical prohibition that could, God forbid, get a person into karis, into extreme spiritual problematic circumstances? And we have similar circumstances elsewhere where the Chachamim might use the word chayiv, which usually chayiv means biblically in trouble, but it actually only means not allowed. It really means usher. So just to clarify again, flower pot attached to the earth, detached from the earth. Abaya says you absolutely can't do it. You're chayiv, and Rashi clarifies. I don't think it means literally chayiv. It means close to chayiv. Toisvis ha'mechayiv makas mordis midrabanan kedepirish bekontris with the sharish lakish. He says, yeah, you're chayiv. What would you be chayiv? Toisvis adds just a little context. Chayiv here doesn't mean chayiv a chatas. You wouldn't have to bring a chatas. It doesn't mean you'd be culpable for stoning. What it means is you would end up being potentially culpable to receive lashes that are called makas mordas, lashes that a person might receive for abandoning and rejecting a rabbinic prohibition. So there is such a thing, not to go in. I don't want to go to the whole subject now of makas mordas. With Hashem's help, we'll get to it in other contexts where it's directly addressed. Suffice it to say, there are those. Yes.
Are we talking about Talmudic times, or are we talking about the times when the temple wasn't burnt yet?
So we are talking about.
It's. I understand that it's old tradition, but how long was it kept in practice after the destruction of the temple?
So it's a great question. If you don't mind, I'm just going to hit mute for a moment.
Are we describing history, or are we describing the current time, current practices for Talmud and for Rashi?
Okay, let me lay it here. In 2020, we certainly do not, there is no bet in the world that is empowered to administer lashes of any kind. In the time of the Talmud, in the halacha of the Talmud, and apparently in the time of the Mishnah, once there was a rabbinic enactments, there were lashes. Now, as far as in the time of the Talmud and beyond, there were varying degrees of autonomy afforded to the Bet Din at different times in Jewish history. And even going back to the time of the temple under Roman rule, there's a big discussion, who killed a certain person. And so there's a discussion if the Jews killed that person, or if they handed him over to Roman authority, if you know what I mean. And so even back then, it wasn't always that the Beis Din had autonomy. However, there were times in ancient Iraq and Babel, even during the time of the Talmud, and I believe even during the time of the Gaonim, and possibly on the rare occasions and beyond that, where there was rabbinic authority to administer, corporal punishment. And there were times where I believe these were administered, even in more recent times, but certainly not in the most recent of time. There certainly is no application, or no one receives lashes. But it deserves a proper study, and I'm sure there are papers done on exactly the history of when these makas mordis were applied. But it's a broadly available remedy or tool at the hands of the chachamim to enforce the laws they enact, and particularly halachic laws of Dirabanan, rabbinic laws. So I hope that gives some kind of answer. Admittedly, we could do more surveying and more study to find exactly when and how it was administered. When we get to the tractate of Makot, which talks, and Sanhedrin, which are a unit about how courts would work, there'll be much more extensive discussion on the topic. Suffice it to say, before we close out this discussion, where Rashi says that removing the rock or the planter would be a derabanan, there are those, I believe, that would actually say this is literally chayiv. So give me 1 second. I'm going to hold off on further going further down this hole. But anyways, that's an interesting and important Rashi to consider. And although he uses the word chayiv, which usually means culpable for biblical, here it means rabbinic. Here it means rabbinic. Tosfos explains it means lashes. Rashi just says it means prohibited. So in a sense, they're not exactly agreeing, but I think Tosfos can be seen as elaborating on Rashi's perspective. We're going to see a similar Gemara, a similar process. The way we analyze the discussion here about not going into a plowed field, there's going to be a similar in structure, a similar discussion about a prohibition of using shards of earthenware instead of a rock. We'll start it, and then tomorrow, I guess on Sunday, we'll revisit and close it out. Rabbi Yochanan taught. One is prohibited from using an earthenware shard on Shabbos. My time, as Limor asks, what is wrong with using a shard? If the issue here is that it's sharp and you may cut yourself in a way that's very not good for your health. A person, a Jewish law, I should say, prohibits putting one's health in danger. So maybe the issue here is that using earthenware shards were understood to bring liability and susceptibility to witchcraft and the trouble that comes from witchcraft. The Gemara is going to elaborate, and then we'll, of course, elaborate. But suffice it to say, it was understood that certain use of shards could make a person susceptible to witchcraft. If that's the case, then one would even be prohibited from using a shard if it's dangerous in the weekday. So why can't you use it? Because using a shard could cause severing of skin tags or hair. And that is a problem. You're not allowed to shave. You're not allowed to pluck hair on Shabbos or part of one's body. So the Gemara says, but what's wrong with that? Davar shein miskaven hu. It's not something that you intend to do. And the Gemara is going to ask, and I suppose, Rashi says, Davar shein miskaven hu v'shamino le Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that says, Davar shein miskaven mutter. If you do not have kavana to do the malacha, then you are not culpable. Yeah, we use that powerful word of kavana. So Amr Rav Nosson bar Oishia. Rav Nosson bar Oishia responds, Gavar Rabba Amar Milsa Nema Beitaima. A great man said this, so let's figure it out. Let's make it make sense. Here's what he said. Really, it's of course prohibited in the weekdays. You know why? Because it's dangerous. Rashi. In the weekday, it's prohibited because you have alternatives. You can use a stone. But on Shabbos, where you're not allowed to use, where halachically there's a preference not to handle stones, which are generally muksa. Because a shard of earthenware comes from a vessel, and vessels are less muksa than a stone, I might think Shapir Dami that there's a preference to allow oneself to be put at risk of medical or metaphysical witchcraft. Better to be susceptible to self-harm than to desecrate Shabbos. Kamash Malan, Allah says no. Better to use a stone. Although we're relying on a loophole and we're relying on some rabbinic wiggle room, we would still prefer to use a stone than to put oneself in danger from witchcraft or cutting oneself. Rashi. During the weekday where there's no problem with stones, of course you can't use pottery because it could harm you. On Shabbos, one might think that it's preferred to not use a stone and to use a shard. Therefore, the halacha teaches us you should always not use a shard on Shabbos, even though hypothetically, in a halachic principle, it would be better. You shouldn't put yourself at risk, and therefore you should use a rock, although it entails the Chachamim making somewhat of a waiver to avoid the law of Muksa. I think we're going to stop over here, and but we're going to do some more talk on Sunday, Mirz Hashem, about witchcraft and a very interesting rule of how one might overcome witchcraft if you were ever targeted by it. Rebel.
I want to go back to the going into someone's field. I'm surprised nobody says anything on Shabbos, going into someone's field, damage to the field, etc., etc., etc.
Well, so two answers, although you're right, maybe we should do a little more research. First of all, the Rambam quotes the Gemara that says that there was an ancient takana from the time of Joshua, when the Jews entered the land of Israel, that I believe passing through someone's field was not considered trespassing. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that might come into play over here. We're just entering a person's field itself might not be considered trespassing, possibly even for the purpose of doing one's function. However, that's not a license to undo or mess up with what a person does. That's point number one. Point number two.
Actually, I think there were different levels of prohibition for different times of the year. I don't remember.
Yes, correct. So if a field is planted and you're going to damage their stuff, there might be lesser degree of prohibition. And when it's going to, so you're correct. There's some more to the topic, but just going into a field might not be considered trespassing. However, in our case, if it's going to damage and undo what the person's done, or it's going to cause them harm, there's no waiver to cause a person harm. So I believe that might be applied to your question. I had a second point, and now I don't remember it, so I'm sorry. So remind me your question again. The question is why is there not more discussion about how you can trespass?
Just going into someone's field, finding a stone, picking up the damage to him, on top of it being Shabbos.
So what would be the damage? Taking the stone or depositing some fertilizer?
If you would have a field, you'd be happy people coming in and defecating in your field.
I would not. I hear in California there's a big problem of people.
Rest my case.
Well, he's actually fertilizing the field by doing so.
Yeah, it's free fertilizer. You should pay me. Anyways, any other closing comments? No, but you're right. We should look a little more into what exactly the waiver and when exactly. But the Gemara itself.
Even the joke is serious because you're not allowed to improve on Shabbos. So you have another problem.
And are you allowed to fertilize a field? All right, so there's some more research necessary over here. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Prayerful wishes for good news, for health and healing, and wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos.
Shalom Bear.
Shalom Bear Chumash. Chumash will follow. We'll end this link, and you'll please rejoin and study today's Chumash.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbos. Shkoyach, thank you.
So.
Shabbos.